So we might make a start this morning. I'm sure some more people will be coming in. They might just be having a few technical issues as they get in, but we'll keep admitting people and they'll be able to join us. But if we make a start, then we'll keep to our program for the day, which will be very tightly organised. And so a warm welcome to you all. And we have some wonderful guest speakers with us today that I'll introduce to you as we go along. And we're going to start our day this morning with an acknowledgement. And Uncle David Miller has kindly agreed to do that for us. And so I'll hand over to him now.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, everybody. My name is David Miller, and I also am on the Brisbane Justice and Peace Commission. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners whose land we are now standing, the Turrbal people north side of the Brisbane River, the Yuggera people south side of the Brisbane River, Quandamooka people of Stradbroke Island, the Gubbi Gubbi people of the Sunshine Coast, not forgetting the Waka Waka people of Cherbourg. As I said, my name is David Miller. I'm a descendant of the Gungaloo people of Central Queensland. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders, past and emerging. As we gather today on this sacred land, let us acknowledge that we are standing on country for which the elders and our ancestors have been custodians for thousands of years, on which have performed age-old ceremonies and celebrations. God of the dreaming, great creative spirit, from the dream time you have given your children the good things of this earth, from the dense forests that cover the hills where the sun goes down in the evening, to the whirling waters of Woolloongabba, the swampy lands and waterholes to the east, the local creeks along the tracks, to the mangroves along the Brisbane River. We acknowledge our living culture and unique role in the life of this country. May the spirit of this place keep us on a good path and walk with us in recognition, respect, restoration, and reconciliation. May I just add, may we walk softly, humbly, and respectfully on our sacred land.
Thank you so much, Uncle David. The beautiful images that you conjured up for us there really remind us of the beauty of the land that's all around us and the wonderful traditions that have kept that land so special in our hearts. So thank you very much for that. And we move forward now with a prayer, and we're very thankful to Jessica, a beautiful guest we have, who is going to read the prayer for us, and so we can pray that in our hearts. Thank you, Jessica.
You're welcome, Elizabeth. Let us come to quiet and rest in God's loving presence. We pray today using a prayer from the Office for Justice, Ecology and Peace, a prayer of sacramentality. God of all creation, the heavens tells of your glory, and the earth is full of wonders that sing of your goodness. Sun, moon, stars and sky, rain, snow, wind and water, animals, birds, trees and flowers, all are shaped by your loving hand. Opened in us an attentiveness that recognizes and welcomes the holy that enfolds us and calls our name. Form us to be people who delight in life as your gift to be revered, savoured, and nourished. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you to the Office for Justice, Ecology and Peace for that beautiful prayer as well. And so today, I'm sure you'll get into the rhythm and the flow of the day. We have some wonderful speakers, as I mentioned before, who'll provide for us great insight and give us much food for thought. So we have a period of input, then we have a time of reflection, a time of sharing with other people who are online here with us today, and a little bit of feedback and we move through the day in that rhythm. We'll also have a break after a couple of speakers so that you can get up and stretch. It's very important when we're online that we make sure we stretch. And if you're anything like me, you'll probably be needing a cup of tea or some other drink by then. And so we'll walk you through the day in that manner so that you have plenty of time and opportunity for reflection, speaking and resting as well. So our first speaker this morning is Dave Copeman, and he's going to speak to us on Southeast Queensland ecological threats and crises that we're currently undergoing. And Dave has held many wonderful roles during his working life, but currently he's the director of the Queensland Conservation Council, and formerly he was the lead organiser of the Queensland Community Alliance. And so Dave brings with him today a wealth of experience and direct knowledge. So we welcome his input. Thank you, Dave, for coming and for sharing all that you know with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I'd like to begin by acknowledging traditional owners of the land where I am here, which is the Quandamuka people on Minjerribah, which is North Stradbroke Island. I'm over here with my son and my wife and his 6 good 12-year-old friends for his 12th birthday. So I'm dialing in via my phone connection, so I hope it'll go smoothly. I was in the surf this morning, took them down for an early swim because they woke up early. And I was trying to think about how I'd start this speech because I knew what I wanted to say, but I wanted to contextualize it. And I guess one of the things that kind of hit me as a piece of humility is that as much as I'm going to be talking about some of the threats and challenges and the things that we are losing or that are changing in Southeast Queensland, there are some constants. You know, the ocean will keep washing up against the Great Sand Islands. The sand will keep moving, and the houses that were built here, right on the edge of the sand, will move as the sand moves. And I think that's a positive thing to remember, is that there are patterns of change and there are patterns of continuation in nature, and they will continue on. But there was an event that happened on the way down to the beach with my son and his friends that kind of also struck me as the challenge that we face. And it's a challenge of the relationship between humans and nature. And it was quite innocent. We were walking down the street. There was a lady who has, I think, moved into a place. She looks like she's a local, not a resident, not a tourist. And she had a female staffy dog who was off leash and running around and coming up to greet the kids. Lovely dog. But one of the things that we love about Stradbroke Island, about Minjerribah, is it's one of the places where my kids still get to connect firsthand to some of the incredible species that make Australia so wonderful. So there's trees just down from that house where there's often a koala. There are kangaroos that you see everywhere. We see dolphins and whales and eagle rays and manta rays and turtles from the gorge. And there's always kangaroos in the grass everywhere. And I've even just recently, walking down, seen an echidna in one of the tracks here. So it's a beautiful part of nature. But in our loving of it, and I think the people, everyone who comes to Australia has some love for it, we don't yet have the practices and habits to be able to effectively care for it. And so this lady, I'm sure, was quite well-meaning, but if that dog keeps hanging around, then those koalas won't be in that tree anymore because they'll move. Or, possibly the well-meaning dog will do what well-meaning dogs do and it will attack one of them. And so that's something I think that really made me think, is that if we are going to address some of the great challenges we face, then we have to bring a new level of awareness as humans to how we interact in this world and how we preserve it. And so what I'm going to try and do over the next 20 or so minutes, I think if that's right, is run through some of the challenges. And I'm going to talk about, I guess, the challenges that we see and the signs of the time as it relates to both climate and nature and biodiversity. And I'm going to deal with them separately, but they actually weave in, and I'll be weaving in the connections between nature and climate together. I then would like to talk about some of the clear solutions that we have for both. some of the things that we could do right now in Southeast Queensland, in Queensland, could really address these. And then the final piece that I'd like to come to is I want to talk about the human element, because this is not, I'm not trying to give a technical presentation or even necessarily an educative presentation, because I think there are better educators and there are better resources than what I'm able to give via my phone connection here from Injeraba. But I think what ultimately Laudato Si is about, and what ultimately the church needs to be about, and the people of faith need to be about as they engage with this, is that human element. How do we bring skills and knowledge and ability of connecting people and taking action together, and the strength that the church has in its human connection to be able to evoke change? And so rather than seeking to educate, I'm hoping in this next 20 minutes to inspire and to encourage action by the church, by the congregations, by the faithful, to take actions on these things, following the exhortation of Laudato Si and Pope Francis. So that's what I'm going to run through for the next 20 minutes, if that's all right, or 15 minutes. And I guess what I wanted to start with is I wanted to start by going big, because as much as I was enjoying being in the beach here at Stratty, I guess the thing that's always present on my mind when I think about the future for my kids, for my son and his friends, is the changing climate and the impact that that will have for him on the life that he will have in the future, and for the life that we'll have together while I'm around with him. We saw just a couple of years ago, you know, the incredible impact of the summer of bushfires, where we saw Sydney and New South Wales burn, and the fires approached us and came up here to Southeast Queensland, and the history and the tradition of managing land that First Nations had been lost in many practices, but also the increasing change in climate meant that we saw an incredible impact. For the first time, hundreds of thousands and millions of Australians realised that their health was being directly impacted by bushfires, which were being caused or in some way made more likely and more severe and more unpredictable by our changing climate. Now, there's a whole lot of signs of the time as it relates to climate. I think the one that I find useful to go back to as a good and powerful summary is the most recent IPCC report on the summary of the global science on climate change. And in that report, as much as it was a collation of years and decades of research from across the world, it was really clear and explicit about what we will see and what the signs are for us here in Southeast Queensland and across Queensland. And what they said was clear. One, the first thing is that the temperature is rising and it will be becoming much hotter. Temperatures are already in eastern Queensland 1.44 degrees higher than they were in 1910. And they're forecast to rise by another 1 to 3.5 degrees over the next 60 to 80 years. So there will be a 1 degree rise in temperature. We know that, and that's the minimum. That's what we here in Queensland, that's the lowest that we can effectively achieve, and it will depend upon global emissions. And if we're not careful, we will see rises towards the 2.5 to the 3.5 degrees Celsius range. This will, as well as the general rise in temperature, this will include incidences of extreme heat. And above 35 degrees Celsius will increase by 50 to 100%. And then incidences of above 40 degrees will increase by 200%. We also know that sea levels will rise. As a direct function of the rising temperature, we will see the seas rise between 40 centimetres to 90 centimetres over the next 60 to 80 years, so between 0.5 metre and 1 metre. Coasts will erode away on our beaches under the current climate change trajectory. By the middle of century, the sandy shorelines, like where I was today, will retreat between 50 and 80 metres around Australasia. There will be more droughts. Of that, we're not, the science is saying there's a medium confidence there, so it's hard to predict. but they have a relative confidence that there'll be more droughts, and there certainly will be less winter and spring rains in Eastern Australia above 2 degrees. And what we do know is that there will be an increased risk of extreme fire risk across Australia, as well as increased river flooding above 2 degrees centigrade, and storm surges will be higher and more frequent. So this is one of the signs that the scientists who have gathered and looked together have tell us we're facing. And I think the other thing that is important as we look around us and as we look at the physical science is, as well as being incredibly impacted by climate change, we are also very deeply and directly connected to driving it. Now, Australians are one of the highest per capita emitters of carbon dioxide or equivalent greenhouse gases in the world. Only the petro-states of the Gulf are clearly ahead of us, and Canada and the United States kind of oscillate with us. So they're either the same or slightly above or slightly below. In Queensland, we're actually responsible for the highest level of emissions across Australia, so 31%. So in some ways, as much as that's a fairly heavy load to bear, the flip side of it is few individual people in the world as a population have the power or the ability to do more to reduce emissions than Australians, and in particular to Queensland. Right now, right here, we have the power to substantially reduce emissions far more than the majority world does, far more than people anywhere else in the world, because of our ability to act, to change. And this isn't necessarily just, riding your bike to the shops instead of a car or taking public transport, as useful as they are, because the really high levels of emissions that we see across Australia, they're not coming from individual choices. They're occurring because of large industrial processes. 45% of emissions in Queensland come from our stationary power sector. So the 8 coal-fired power stations that generate 60% of our electricity, and it varies on any given day in Queensland, are producing 45%. And then the emissions that come just from exporting and extracting coal and gas, including the fugitive emissions, this isn't the burning of them overseas, this is just the extraction of them, that's another 20%. So, as much as it's important that we do our own individual action, the far more powerful thing we do is need to make those transitions towards more sustainable, 100% renewable energy, avoid the export of coal and gas. And we've got the science and the technology that we know to address these emissions. We have the ability right now, the science has basically moved ahead so that we have the financial imperatives to transition to renewables and to generate our energy from clean renewable sources are there. It's actually cheaper now to invest in renewables than it is to continue operating our coal-fired power stations, and particularly to continue to operating gas. But also the technology is there for a number of the other transitions that we need to do. What's lagging behind is the political will. And I think one of the fascinating signs of the time on climate is just what we've seen in the last 2 weeks with both News Limited and also the Conservative coalition government at a federal level making a decision that they both are ready to commit to net zero. Now, we haven't seen the government formally pledge to net zero target, but I think this one of the clear signs we can see is in the coming weeks that will occur. The fact that the Prime Minister has committed to go to Glasgow makes it clear we will see that commitment. So the sign is that the technology is moving, the science is moving. We now have the ability to move towards to massively reduce our emissions in line with the Paris commitments to be able to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. But we really need to move our politics to be stronger on this. I'll talk a bit more about that in the solutions, but before I go into it, the other sign I think we need to think about, as well as climate, is also around biodiversity and nature. So Australia has incredible biodiversity and incredible ranges of unique species that are seen nowhere else in the world. When the first examples of the platypus and the echidna were talked about by the Royal Society in London, people thought it was a made-up thing. It was so weird and diverse and different. And yet, regrettably, Australia is also one of the countries that is most at risk of huge losses in biodiversity. We are losing biodiversity in alarming rates. We've actually got one of the highest rates of extinction in the world. More than 10% of Australia's land mammals are now extinct, and another 21% are threatened or declining. And that's research back from 2015. Populations of threatened birds, plants, fish, and invertebrates are continuing to decrease, and the list of threatened species is growing. In Queensland, it's over 1,000, and you had just another 50 added last year. And like, there's real hope. There are areas of localised population increase where targeted management actions are being undertaken. 2 weeks ago, I was at Lady Elliot Island, and there, through a combination of ecotourism, government funding, donors and support, we've seen incredible increases in a range of migratory seabirds because they've revegetated and protected the island. They took the goats off it. They are restoring the damage that was done by the guano mining. And once again, the birds are coming back. And they're controlling the feral animals and they're controlling the other issues. But these are the exceptions rather than the broad trend. Since the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act was introduced, the threat status of species has deteriorated. There are approximately 4 times more vulnerable species showing declines, so they're becoming more threatened than is showing an increase. So it's a 4-to-1 ratio. And there's only 13 animal species that have been removed from the EPBC's Threatened Species Act over the 20 years of operation. So this is a really worrying thing. And it's true at a local level in Queensland, where we still don't have a biodiversity strategy. It was abolished under the Newman government, and the Queensland government, as much as it's required to by the Nature Conservation Act, has not yet published the biodiversity protection strategy to look at how they can restore it. So Australia is among one of the top 7 countries worldwide that's responsible for 60% of the world's biodiversity loss between 1996 and 2008, according to a study published in 2017 by the journal Nature. And Australia ranks second worst in the group, with a biodiversity loss of between 5 to 10%. Now, one of the things that the sign of the times in terms of what we're seeing from government there is that Graham Samuels, the businessman, was prompted by the government to conduct a review of the federal laws. And in fact, some of the figures that I'm talking about here were drawn on that review. And he said that we need a massive change to the laws because they're not strong enough, because they're not achieving the results that we need to. They're a piecemeal protection. Instead of that, instead of listening to his reviews, instead of actually coming up with a plan to restore threatened species, the federal government tried to devolve the same weak, flawed laws that exist under the EPBC to the state governments, so that there was no effective federal oversight, and the state governments would be the one-stop shop for developers about making assessments. And, you know, if you want an example of the impact of when you have only one decision maker being involved in approving damaging programs, the recent proposal for Toondah Harbour that would be built in a Ramsar wetland that would be destroying areas that are protected for international reasons for migratory flight birds, that you can't see a stronger example of a failure of leadership by the state or federal government at Toondah Harbour. So because of this, there's a real need for us to actually get stronger laws. Fortunately, the EPBC devolution has been blocked by the Senate and by the state government, and actually State Environment Minister Megan Scanlon was one of the strongest state ministers standing up saying they won't accept this. But what's happening right now is that to try and address the loss of particular species, as well as the EPBC, which is a planning exercise or affecting approval process, there's also recovery plans that exist under federal legislation. Now, the federal government just came out a month ago and said they're planning to axe 184 of these recovery plans from federal legislation, which would mean there is no requirement to recover the populations of these threatened species, effectively walking away from their legal responsibilities to prevent extinction and biodiversity loss. Now, in Queensland, we have 1,000 species threatened. We've seen the worsening of this with the Gondwanan forest burning, the bleaching of the reef, and there's other shifts in climate that are creating an extinction crisis. So this is why it's so essential. And I wanted to talk about one particular species because it draws out the link between climate change, biodiversity, and protecting a threatened species. Now, this isn't actually from Southeast Queensland. It's from the work that Cairns and Far North Environment Council has been doing with the Environmental Defenders Organisation on a species called the spectacled flying fox. Now, they are a critical species. The spectacled flying fox is only really found in the wet tropics area. It's not like the flying foxes we see in Brisbane and Meanjin that are everywhere. They've suffered an 80% population crash over the last 15 years. So from around about 326,000 in 2004, they have declined down to approximately 78,000 in 2017. Habitat loss, cyclones, and actually being chased away from their areas. Now, this got really tragic back in 2017, where a single heat event where there was incredibly high temperatures in that area led to 23,000 animals in Cairns dying. And literally thousands were dying every day, just falling from the roosts inside Cairns. And it was incredibly distressing for carers, environmentalists who were trying to save them by getting them to cooler climates, cooler areas, but were really only able to save 10 to 15 a day while thousands were dying. The reason this matters is because they're a keystone, well, partly because they're incredibly important and beautiful animals in their own right, but they are a keystone species. These spectacled flying foxes connect up the Daintree and the rainforests. They distribute seed, they distribute pollen, and a lot of those, some of the oldest rainforests in the world, which if you've ever been to, are incredibly beautiful, are dependent upon species like this to fertilize or to distribute seeds so that the trees and the other key things continue to grow. Now, in 2013, the Newman government made changes to the Nature Conservation Act and introduced as a right authority for councils to disperse flying fox roosts. And they effectively devolved the management of flying foxes to regional councils. So without impact assessment, public consultation, no notice or reporting, we don't know how many times councils have done this with these flying foxes because there's no requirement to record it. There was a recovery plan for these flying foxes, but it expired in April 2020. And there is a team in the government federally which is drafting a new recovery plan for the species. But at the time that we were doing this research about a month ago, they don't know if this axing of the 200 recovery plans means that that will occur. So it may be that as well as no oversight, no protection at a state level, councils responding to the concerns that they have from tourism operators around the Cairns Library who are worried about the noise and therefore moving them on, in spite of the fact that tourists are coming to see our nature. We don't know what's going to happen because at a state and a federal level, we're seeing failures. And
Dave, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I was just, it's my task, sorry, to keep people on time. If I could give you a 1 or 2 minute warning, sorry to do that.
That's okay. No, thank you.
Thank
so
you.
That's one example. And I guess what I wanted to say is we have the solutions when it comes to both nature and climate. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. One of the solutions on climate is to make the transition to renewable energy, and that's cheaper and more effective. We can power ourselves to 100% renewable, and we need to do so by 2030. We can electrify all of the things we do. That will result in cost savings for people, but also massively reduce the emissions. In nature, we need to expand our protected areas. So we only have 8.2% of Queensland protected. That's the lowest of any Australian state. We need to get to 17%. And I guess finally, we need a biodiversity strategy and stronger planning and approval laws. So all of these things are things that are possible. I guess the thing that I want to finish with is how do we get there? Because the research that environmental groups do tell us that people care about nature and they care about climate. There's a majority in every seat of federal seat in Australia to act on climate change. 1 in 4 voters rate it as the most important issue. Even half of coalition voters want greater action on climate change, and 71% of voters don't see coal and gas as part of the future energy mix. But the problem is that we're not moving from those, if you like, survey result answers to action. And some of the research the sociologists have looked into this has said we actually need communities that bring people together around ethoses of continued action, particularly in faces of things such as so broad as biodiversity loss and climate loss, that there is a lack of hope. And in some ways, environment groups and others are looking to the habits and the practices of religion and of church, not necessarily, you know, in terms of just whether you stand on your position on God or your position on the teachings of Jesus, but actually looking at the habits of coming together in solidarity and worship and connection as critical to continue to protect areas. And in many ways, this is us white folks learning to build into our own culture some things that the First Nations had in their culture and continue to have, an ethos of action around protection of country. Now, we can learn from First Nations, but we also need to be creators of our own culture that will drive us forward. And so that's, I guess, what I saw in Laudato Si was within the Catholic Church, that exhortation. And I think that for the rest of the movement, we've got to think about that. We've got to think about how do we stop being passively supporting around climate change and nature, and how do we move to action, but a sustained action that is hopeful and based upon the belief that there is success. And I mean, there are examples I can give, and I haven't measured my time as well as I'd like to in terms of giving examples of where we are having success. So I'd really be happy to speak to that if we'd like to. But thank you so much for the chance to speak, and I'd love to go through some more details around that with folks in the future.
Thank you so much, Dave. Your obvious passion for this subject has really captured our imaginations, and our efforts, I'm sure, will be fruitful in discerning the way to go forward. And as you say, nutting out the how that we can do that. And we're really grateful to you for sparing us time today away from that beautiful birthday party celebration. So we thank you. I invite everyone now to have a moment of reflection, to just think about all the things that Dave has said, all the beautiful examples that he's brought up, all the questions, all the wonderings. And so we just spend a minute in our time of reflection. So he has postgraduate work in the New Testament, and his passion is St. Paul and the letters of St. Paul, and the Synoptic Gospels as well. So his studies have focused on that. So he brings a wealth of biblical knowledge to us today, and he's going to explore for us the biblical foundations of Laudato Si as we come into this period of time where we're really going into the underpinnings of Laudato Si. So thank you, Ian, for being with us today, and we're really grateful and look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. I am going to attempt, in typical fashion as an academic, to use a PowerPoint. So that'll just give us something to focus on. Just bear with me while I...
It's working beautifully.
No, it is, but I've just got to move things around on the screen.
Oh, sure.
And start it. Okay, we're good. We're right. You know, unfortunately, in the light of the pandemic, I spend a lot of time in Zoom teaching now, so I've got very familiar with the processes. So thank you for the invitation to make a contribution to, I think, what is a very important workshop. In our breakout room, we were talking about how Dave brought out really strongly the notion that the enormity of the task can often lead to a loss of hope. But I think the flip side of that was where Dave talked about our individual efforts are important, but they're not enough. We need the political will, we need a movement of community, and we can do something, you know, by joining together to agitate for change. And I think this is very much at the heart of what Pope Francis is saying in Laudato Si. He reminds us that though humans are part of creation, we also have a responsibility to be the voice of creation. That we're the ones that must speak out on behalf of creation. So on that note, I just want to begin by maybe looking at a few statistics. Believe it or not, there are 60 separate biblical quotes. Now, he quotes some numerous times, but there are 60 separate passages quoted often, and some more often than others, throughout the course of Laudato Si. And interestingly, the Old Testament quotes outweigh the New Testament quotes. There are 34 of these. Most of them come from the book of Genesis, and I'll explain why in the course of our discussion. And the bulk of these appear, as you would expect, in the two chapters. Chapter 2, the Gospel of Creation, and Chapter 6, Ecological Education and Spirituality. Now, it's a rather interesting thing to do in a document, as Pope Francis himself admits, is addressed to all people of goodwill. So why should it include a chapter, he says, but really there's two chapters, that deal with the convictions of believers, and particularly deal with the sacred texts of one particular group of believers? Well, he makes the point that there is a very long Catholic tradition of dialogue between faith and reason. And he argues that while science and religion bring quite distinctive approaches to any significant question that concerns both disciplines, there is the possibility of dialogue, a dialogue that can lead to a more integrated, or as he would call it, an integral ecological approach to major questions facing us in terms of the environment. The primary rubric, or the key, as he himself points out, is that the biblical view of the cosmos is one of creation. That is, that all that we see, all that we partake of, all that we experience in the cosmos is the result of a divine decision to create, as opposed to the primary rubric of science as nature, as something that simply occurs perhaps by accident. And that's a real clear delineation that any dialogue must try to bridge. And I think it's something that Francis does quite effectively. So let's begin with the biblical view. And of course, most beautifully expressed in things such as the Psalms, where you have the psalmist singing of the beauty of the heavens that's perceived to be the work of the hands of God, the moon and stars set in their place. And the psalmist here, particularly in Psalm 8, ponders the question is, what is humanity that the divine is mindful of us, and the children of humanity that God should care for them? Yet you have made us little less than gods, crowned us with glory and honour. You have given us rule over the works of your hands and put all things at our feet. There is here an irony, isn't there? That on the one hand, humans emerge as the pinnacle of creation with a particular dignity, but they also have a responsibility. And this comes out very strongly in the very first section of Genesis, the great hymn to creation, where it ends on day 6. Well, it ends in day 7, but the penultimate day, on day 6, we find God decides to create human beings in the image of God, the imago Dei, as we say, after the very likeness of God, to have dominion. And that's a really important word, often misunderstood. So when we look at the word dominion in the biblical record, it doesn't mean, as we might imagine, to rule over or to dominate. Instead, it is to take responsibility for. And we can see this if we trace through the whole biblical record, particularly when the Bible begins to talk about the advent of the monarchy and kings in Israel. And they're given dominion, but it's quite clear that that concept of dominion is one of a responsibility for the community. So at the very start of the biblical record, there's this image of humans created in God's image. But what does that mean? It means to have the ability to steward all that we share in this cosmos that God creates for us. And so it ends for the very first time in the various stages of creation with God looking down on everything he made and saying or seeing that it is very good. And Pope Francis makes a point of this. All previous stages of creation, God sees that it is good, but on day 6, he looks at the complete work at which humans are part and sees that it is very good. But as I noted, there is an inherent irony here when we drill down. The biblical concept of human dignity and responsibility, of creation as the result of God, was forged in the anvil of war and pestilence and death and exile and annihilation. The book of Genesis reached its final form during the Babylonian exile, when the last remnants of the Jewish people, or the Judahites as they were at this stage, were carried off into exile. The great Temple of Solomon was destroyed and the land was burned. And yet it's in the period after this, as a people in exile, they decided, in fact, not to disappear into history. 200 years earlier, the northern tribes in Israel were carried off into exile by the Assyrians and were lost, never heard of again. The two remaining tribes that were carried off from Judah into Babylonian exile decided to preserve their identity by telling stories. And from that exercise, we get the great stories in Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Kings, etc. But the irony is that it's in the midst of this loss, in the midst of war, that they can perceive of the dignity of the human person. But of course, they also saw that at the heart of that human experience was also one of frailty and failure. And indeed, the stories, the great mythological stories of Genesis 1 to 11, chronicle in a story-like form the way in which human failure can degenerate to widespread evil and often to the destruction to relationships, not only between humans, but with the environment as well. And they see at the heart of this almost a fundamental flaw in human being, pride and hubris that leads to murder and war and ultimately environmental collapse as well. Pope Francis puts it rather well about the Babylonian exile. He says, the experience of the Babylonian captivity provoked a spiritual crisis which led to a deeper faith in God. Now, God's creative omnipotence was given pride of place in order to exhort the people to regain their hope in the midst of their wretched predicament. What they saw when they went into Babylon was a religious practice and belief that deified nature, that saw humans as at the predicament was that they were caught up in fate, that there was nothing that they as mere human beings could do about the bad things that were happening in the world. And as Pope Francis points out in Laudato Si, it is that experience of looking at that forced the Israelites to look back into their own truths and say, you know what? That's not right. Creation is in fact the work of the one God. And we have a particular responsibility and indeed have even the ability to make a difference in the world. And that lies at the heart of the Christian anthropology, or the Judeo-Christian anthropology that underwrites all of the stories in the Bible. But of course, the issue lies further back in time than that. This is, I guess, the scientific view. The universe began some 15 billion years ago in an unimaginably small, dense, hot, compressed ball of matter that then explodes, and there's rapid inflation and expansion and cooling, and there's a coalescence of matter, gas, galaxy, stars, planets, and ultimately life. And all of it is evolving and expanding and growing and dying, and then we have the emergence of consciousness. Humans appear about 2.5 million years ago, that is, in the past. But they continue to evolve, to die, to grow, to change. And this raises really important questions for us as human beings. What's the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? With apologies, of course, to Douglas Adams. Two factors that have been brought to light, I think, by science is that there is a complexity and a relationality to the cosmos. There is an interconnectedness and an interdependence between all that exists. We're not separate from that. We're very much a part of the whole fabric of this interconnectedness and relationality. And evolution really is about the survival of cooperation. That is, that human societies grow and change, sometimes improve and then degenerate and die. But there is a movement forward where we only survive by working together. Humans, by banding together into communities and building a better life for those communities, that's what evolution is all about. It's about this building greater levels of complexity, particularly within human community, but human communities then must also, because of their recognition to be interconnected with everything else, support the various ecological systems that underpin that growing complexity. There is, of course, a cost to evolution, and that's indeterminacy. Things can go wrong. Disease, earthquakes, pestilence, and death. And the irony is that often these are necessary for the development of greater levels of complexity and cohesion. all of which, of course, the biblical authors were very much aware. They often ask the question, why me? And the classic here, of course, is the book of Job, which is a fanciful debate between friends, Job and a circle of friends, and God about the justice of God's actions. They look at bad things happening to good people, if you like, particularly to Job and his family, and they ask the questions, why did God allow this to happen? And so Job and his friends effectively put God on trial. It's a wonderful book. And Job demands an answer from God. Why do bad things happen to good people? And his friends put forward various answers. Perhaps it's punishment from you've done something wrong. But Job says, no, I was a righteous man. Or perhaps it's an invitation to repent. These are the simple views of divine justice that are put forward by Job's friends. You know, you've done wrong, therefore God calls you to repent. But Job says, no, I was a good person. And so he continues to demand an answer from God. And God answers by taking him on this great tour of the cosmos. And he points to the wonders and the complexity of creation, and also to the relative insignificance of a single human life. Which is not to say, as Pope Francis makes the point in Laudato Si, that each individual life doesn't have an importance. But in terms of Job, the idea is here that we exist for others, that we only really find our purpose when we cooperate with others in bringing about a better world. And so as Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, the ultimate purpose of other creatures is not to be found in us. Rather, all creatures are moving forward with us and through us towards a common point of arrival, which is God in that transcendent fullness where the risen Christ embraces and illuminates all things. Which points, of course, I think, to the elephant in the room. And that is what we commonly call the problem of evil. Why do things go wrong? And this, of course, is a problem particularly for monotheists. Like, it's fine if you're a polytheist, like the Babylonians were. If bad things happen to you, well, you can just blame the bad gods. If good things happen to you, well, it's the good gods. But if something goes wrong for us as monotheists, then it must be something that we did. That ultimately is the problem for us. So how do we deal with the problem of evil? Well, that takes us back to the Bible again. The Bible didn't drop from heaven. It's a collection of various texts, various literary genres, written at different times by different authors for different reasons and for different audiences. But most importantly, it's important to remember, sorry about the oxymoron, I should say the redundancy, it evolved out of prayer, reflection, and liturgy over a very long time. It evolved out of an ongoing community reflection about what is the meaning of life, what is our role in creation. That's the Bible dropping from heaven. So the Bible is primarily the fruit of an ongoing reflection on the problem of evil, or as the biblical writers would ask, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do things go wrong with the environment around us in particular? And if we distill down the wisdom of those thousands of years of reflection, there are 3 points worth making. They are observable facts, if you like. The complexity, the wonder, and the relationality of the cosmos. Just as science has taught us, there is an interconnectedness and there is an interdependence between all things. And this comes out very strongly in the Psalms. Those beautiful hymns often that reflect upon the nature of humanity's place in creation. Secondly, though, and almost in tension with that, is the idea that there is a cost to an ever-changing world. I mean, we could pause if we had more time and reflect on, could God have created a world where nothing changes? Could God have created a perfect world? Well, yes, in his omnipotence, he could, but in his omniscience, he was probably aware that nothing would ever change and we would not have free will. So the world is subject to indeterminacy, disease, earthquakes, pestilence, war, death, and ironically, how all those things can lead to the development of greater levels of social cohesion, technological development, and learning. And the wisdom literature brings that out very strongly. The wisdom writers reflect upon that inherent tension in the human experience. And finally, the third observable factor is that we believe in a God who reveals the divine being as both the creator, so the origin of all things, and Father, one who cares, a God of majesty and power who works through nature through creation, and a God of love and relationship who works through humanity. So the whole rubric of the covenantal relationship underpins all of the Bible, that God calls us into a relationship with him. But the fine print on that contract is God doesn't really care too much how we treat him. God cares more about how we treat other people and how we treat the creation. And that's what's important. So, very quickly, a very quick survey of Genesis 1 to 11. The Bible opens up with this wonderful hymn to creation, which is fundamentally a reworking of the Babylonian creation myth. God is presented as the creator of an ordered world, and humans are the imago Dei. And they live in an interdependent universe, and Sabbath, and the observance of Sabbath, is a divine institution that lies at the heart of this creative process, that humans should take time out to think about what their role is in that creation. And then in Genesis 2 to 3, we have a slight retelling, or a different retelling of the story of humans being created as a living voice, which is nephesh, fundamentally means throat. So they're created as a living being or a living voice, and they're given the great commission to be stewards of the earth. But then things go wrong because of the frailty of human nature and the created order. And we have the story of the fall, which fundamentally, at the heart, results from the fact that humans want to be like gods. And this is a theme that will be woven right throughout the entire tapestry of the biblical record. And as a result of that desire to be like gods, there's a breakdown in relationships between humans and God, between the humans and their own self, between others, between men and women, but also with the environment. Humans are cast out of the garden, and they have to work hard to have the ground from which they first came bring forth food for them to eat. Life will now be a struggle, and it will be a constant struggle with the environment. Things begin to slip even further with Cain and Abel, and you have a further breakdown in the relationship. You have the first murder, and again, those relationships with God, with self, with others, and the environment are exacerbated in this story of the killing of his brother Cain. Hears, if you like, the voice of the blood of his brother calling forth from the ground for justice. And we're told that the earth becomes infertile as a result of the poison brought about by the death of the first, as a result of the first murder. And it ends with God regretting that he even made human beings. And so we have the story of the flood, which is really a story of uncreation. And again, it draws upon a widespread Mesopotamian, Babylonian mythological concept. But in the hands of the biblical writers, it takes on a very different, meaning. It's again exploring that breakdown in relationships. Widespread evil has only come about because humans want to be like gods. They want to dominate others, and they want to dominate the environment. And as a result of that, nature turns against humanity. And then finally in the Tower of Babel, we have where even nations can no longer talk to one another. Human pride and hubris leads to the ultimate breakdown in relationships. There's a wonderful book by Margaret Nutting Ralph called And God Said What? And she charts, and this chart I got here comes from there, and I haven't got enough time to explore this, but she charts the way in which these important relationships break down incrementally through these stories until it reaches the final story of the Tower of Babel. Humans now are powerless to reach Hashem, and humans can't even speak to each other. And God comes up with a solution. He calls people into covenant, and he calls significant people to speak to that community about that covenant relationship. Abraham, Moses, the prophets, and ultimately Jesus. As Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, yet all is not lost. Human beings, are capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing again what is good and making a new start despite the mental and social conditioning. I've just got an eye on the time here. There's an irony at the heart of the biblical narrative. Bad things happen because humans try to be like gods. We try to dominate rather than take responsibility for others and for the environment. In other words, we fail to know our place. God intervenes, restores order, draws us ever closer to the divine being, but humans fail again and again. And then ultimately, God intervenes by becoming human so that we can become like God. So the real irony here is that everything goes wrong because we desire to be like gods, but God provides us the way to be like God. In particular, to be like Christ, who is the new Adam, the new image of God. And in the Gospels, Jesus is seen as fulfilling the prophetic promises to rectify those relationships that broke down in those stories in Genesis 1 to 11. He heals the sick and casts out demons and frees the captive. And he restores the relationship with self. He eats with the marginalised, sinners, prostitutes, tax collectors, shares table fellowship, and restores relationship with others. He safely navigates the wilderness, walks on water, calms the storm, and is unmolested by the dark forces of nature. And he restores the relationship with the environment. And ultimately, he suffers death, saying yes to the Father, and is restored to life by God, and provides the means by which we, too, can be resurrected. He restores the relationship with God. So, which doesn't mean that things won't go wrong. Humanity is matter. We're earth, animated by the breath or the wind or the spirit of God. And therefore we are connected to the earth. Francis makes that point really strongly, that we now must, if you like, step down from our throne and realise that we are part of creation. We are interconnected to everything else. Bad things can still happen to good people, but human beings are animated by God's breath or spirit, and as Christians, reborn through baptism. We have a duty to be the voice of the voiceless, as the living voice, the living nephesh, which necessarily includes creation and the environment. So the nature of human being and divine being is relationality, which we understand in that terms of communion. It's why we understand God as a Trinity. He is the embodiment, the divine embodiment of relationship, of communion. And that should be reflected in us as the Imago Dei. So the promise of human being is to build and maintain relationships with God, with self, with the environment, and with others. And that is the vision of the Bible, as well as, I think, Pope Francis. So a few quick quotes here. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature. An integral ecology includes taking time to recover a serene harmony with creation, reflecting on our own lifestyle and our ideals, and contemplating the Creator who lives among us and surrounds us. And then strategies for a solution to the climate crisis demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring the dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. Francis, quite rightly, picking up that biblical vision, says all of this is important. Everything is interconnected. If we want to, restore the environment, we also have to restore broken relationships. We have to deal with things like human poverty and marginalisation and racism, and all of this is interconnected because the universe is interconnected. So I think that brings me to the end, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Ian. We're really grateful that you could come with us today and give us that incredible background of the biblical foundations of Laudato Si. And I'm sure people will be really have so much to think about. And really the thing that came home for me is that beautiful word of responsibility that you gave rather than dominion. And I also love how God enters into covenant with not always the most obvious of people in his choices. So that's really encouraging also. So we're grateful for your time, and I know you have to leave with a family commitment today. And so thank you very much for being with us. And I'm sure everyone will join with me in saying a great thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I should point out the group I was in, there was only 2 of us, so you might need to
Oh,
restructure
right. Okay, yes, Tony will probably be on that. He's good.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
And goodbye to all, and good work on what you're doing in your various parishes and places where you're working for social justice and for the environment. So thank you for the invitation to contribute today.
Thank you.
Okay, see you later. Bye.
So, bye-bye, Ian. And so we take our minute of my sincere apologies to you that I wrote down the incorrect time copying onto my agenda. And I did think that was a long break. So I do sincerely apologise. So welcome back. And we now have the pleasure of listening to Dr. Sandy Cornish. Sandy has held many important roles in Australia and overseas, and she currently leads the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference Office for Justice, Ecology and Peace. So she's got a big job there. She's a member of the Vatican's Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, and also a member of the Laudato Si Action Platform Working Group for Parishes and Dioceses. So Sandy is eminently qualified to lead us through today the theological foundations and insights of Laudato Si. So moving from the biblical to the theological. So we welcome you today, Sandy, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm joining you today from Guringai country on the northern beaches of Sydney, which is home to the last mainland colony of little penguins. Now, I've got a PowerPoint, but it's nowhere near as exciting as Ian's. Its main virtue is that it might help me not to get off topic and to take little detours that are interesting to me, because there's so much that could and should be said, but I'm not sure whether we're going to have time for all of that. Elizabeth may well have her work cut out for her in keeping me on time. So I'm just getting the slideshow going now. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. So this is where we're going. Laudato Si calls us to a renewed anthropology or understanding of what it is to be human. It calls us to reconsider our place in the universe, that is, to be open to a new cosmology. Together, these movements point to a new way of living our relationship with the divine in time and space, reflected in values, attitudes, commitments, and practices. In other words, it calls us to a new spirituality. So Laudato Si leads us to the great questions of who we are before God and in the universe, and how we should live. It guides us towards a new consciousness. If we want real and lasting change, we can't avoid these deep down questions that go to the heart of our spirituality. And I think that Laudato Si teaches us that the ecological crisis is, at its core, a spiritual crisis. But it's not until the final chapter of Laudato Si that Francis takes up the theme of conversion and a new ecological spirituality. In a sense, the whole encyclical builds towards this, and in so doing, it demonstrates the dynamics of ecological conversion. So I'm going to comment on 4 of the theological foundations of Laudato Si's call to conversion and to an ecological spirituality. And they are the creation by the Trinity, the universal communion of creatures, creation as a common inheritance, and the sacramentality of all creation. Then I'll move to speaking a little about conversion and ecological spirituality. So that's basically the itinerary for our next few moments. Francis reminds us that to speak of creation, rather than the environment or saving the planet, is to acknowledge a creator. The universe is not random and arbitrary. It was made. It's a cosmos imbued with meaning and order, as Ian was telling us. Every person and everything was willed into being by God's love. God made the world, and God saw that it was good, very good. Christian spirituality should not despise the world. The most fundamental reason why anyone who claims to be a Christian should be concerned about ecological matters is that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The Trinity, by definition, is impossible to fully grasp and define because God is God. When Abraham asked God, "Who are you?" the response was not a lecture about the Trinity. If you need a little bit of amusement later today, you could go to YouTube and search for St. Patrick's bad analogies. It turns out that most of St. Patrick's analogies for the Trinity are actually heretical. Gerard Moore pointed out to me that people often fall into giving the persons of the Trinity position descriptions in a timeline. So we tend to think of God the Father as coming first and being the creator, Jesus coming next, being our brother, lover, saviour, And then the Spirit finally turns up and is our sustainer. But in Laudato Si, Francis says something much more biblically grounded. He says, the world was created by the three persons acting as a single divine principle, but each one of them performed this common work in accordance with their own property. Maybe that's not a whole lot clearer for all of us. The Australian bishops, in their social justice statement for this year, explain it in another way. They say that the three-person God is a trinity of love. Every creative act and every part of creation emerges from this divine interplay of love. Yeah. And that's why all that is bears the Trinitarian marks of relationality, of mutuality and generativity, so much of which Ian has just introduced to us. So the first theological foundation is that God created the world, including us. We too are creatures, part of creation and not outside it or above it. Previous teachings emphasised human beings as the pinnacle of creation, endowed with intelligence and free will, and therefore responsible for the stewardship of the rest of creation. But Pope Francis puts us firmly in our place. He reminds us that we are creatures amongst other creatures. He explains that the Genesis mandate to have dominion over the earth has at times been incorrectly interpreted by Christians, and that this text must be read in its context and with an appropriate hermeneutic. Reading it with an appropriate hermeneutic is what Ian just did for us. So I think it'll actually take us some time to really take on board the implications of this shift in Christian anthropology. Moving then to this idea of a universal communion of creatures. Each creature, whether human or otherwise, was willed into being by God and has an inherent worth. Each one speaks of the Creator. We are part of God's creation in a relationship of kinship with the rest of creation. The canticle of the creatures with its family relationships, brother, sun, sister, moon, continually reinforces this point, running like a leitmotif throughout the encyclical. Everything is connected. Every creature is necessary. Our interdependence is willed by God. Tilling and keeping the garden, Francis says, implies a relationship of mutual responsibility between human beings and nature. Mutual responsibility. This is a really critically important point. We have a responsibility to care for God's creation, but the things of creation also care for and sustain us. We can't survive, let alone thrive, without them. Perhaps Pope Francis understands this so well because of his intimate familiarity with the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. In the second exercise of the first week, we're invited to consider how, despite our sins, creation sustains us. So I'd like to share with you a contemporary reading of an extract from week 1 of Ignatius's spiritual exercises. This comes from David Fleming. I look at my world. Everything cooperates to continue to give me life and strength. I look at the whole support system of air and water, warmth and coolness, light and darkness, all the produce of the earth, all the works of human hands. Everything contributes to my well-being. All I can do is give thanks, wondering at God's forgiving love, which continues to give me life up until this moment. We're not overseers or managers of our sisters and brothers. Kinship is a much more mutual and reciprocal idea than stewardship. Other creatures too have a right to what they need from the bounty of the earth. They too are willed by God, have a purpose, reflect something of their Creator, and have an intrinsic value that must be respected. They too give praise to God and are moving towards the fullness of God. Catholic social teaching is often criticised as being excessively anthropocentric or human-centred. Laudato Si goes a long way towards resetting our understanding of who we are before God. We are God's creatures, and in relation to the rest of creation, we are kin to all other creatures, sharing the same source and destination. Pope Francis sums this up saying, "A spirituality which forgets God as all-powerful and creator is not acceptable." That is how we end up worshipping earthly powers, or ourselves usurping the place of God, even to the point of claiming an unlimited right to trample his creation underfoot. You'll find that at number 75. So we don't stand outside of or above creation. We are not God. Although, as Ian reminds us, we often fall into the habit of trying to be gods. Ideas like these have in the past been greeted with deep suspicion of pantheism. Pope Francis, however, stresses that all creatures, including us, are part of a universal family, or a sublime communion, he calls it, joined together by God and owned by God. And this is not the same thing as attributing divinity to nature. So the second theological foundation reminds us that our sense of kinship and solidarity should exclude no one and nothing. Hence, we can affirm with Francis that peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are three absolutely interconnected themes which cannot be separated and treated individually. So moving now to our next theological foundation that I want to highlight. Creation as a common inheritance. We're very familiar in Catholic social teaching with the idea that the earth is essentially a shared inheritance whose fruits are meant to benefit everyone. We call it the universal destination of goods. And for centuries, the Church has taught that the right to private property is never absolute. It always has a social mortgage. In Laudato Si, Francis extends the traditional principle of the common good by including the dimension of time. The common good is not only universal, it's also intergenerational. The natural environment is a collective good, the patrimony of humanity as a whole, the responsibility of everyone, and a responsibility that extends from generation to generation. Francis reminds us that, and I quote, "In the Bible, the God who liberates and saves is the same God who created the universe, and these two ways of acting are intimately and inseparably connected." Injustice is not invincible, he reminds us. And so with this third theological foundation, Francis is reminding us that every ecological approach needs to incorporate a social perspective which takes into account the fundamental rights of the poor and the underprivileged. And so we come to the sacramentality of creation. Near the end of Laudato Si, Pope Francis says that the universe unfolds in God, who fills it completely. Hence there is mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. If we pay attention, we can recognise the divine presence in all of creation. And the Australian bishops explain, the more we recognise this divine presence, the more we uncover the sacramentality of creation. The universe is infused with the love of God, and we are immersed in a world that continues to reveal the presence of the divine word. Wonder and awe at the beauty of the world is a common human experience, whether we're religious or not. It can lead to a sense of feeling connected to something bigger, to the transcendent, and of being a small part of things, like Job. For believers, wonder and awe at God's creation is an act of worship, a reverence for God, and of acknowledgement of our status as creatures. It moves us to love and care for the world, including each other and all creatures. So this fourth theological foundation reminds us that together with the book of Scripture, God speaks to us through the book of creation. So now we come to conversion. So we've been hearing about this call to an ecological conversion from popes since 1990 and from our own Australian bishops since 2002 in the social justice statement of that year. We need to make sure that it's not just an empty slogan or worse, an exercise in wagging our fingers at other people. You need to be subject of an ecological conversion. Conversion is not so much a decision as a process. It's not just about changing our minds, but rather a shift at the level of the heart and the will that results in sustained changed action. We should be mindful that the ecological conversion to which Laudato Si calls us is a dimension of a broader, or Pope Francis uses the word, overall conversion. Perhaps we might say a more integral conversion. Through the process of conversion, we allow the effects of our encounter with Jesus Christ to become evident in our relationship with the world around us. This touches every dimension of our personal and communal lives. And as the Australian bishops point out, our ecological conversion entails an economic conversion. So in Laudato Si, we're invited to become painfully aware of the cry of the earth and the suffering that we inflict on creation. We're invited to allow the effects of our encounter with Jesus to become evident in our relationship with the world around us. This calls for a spirit of generous care, full of tenderness. It calls for gratitude, generosity, an awareness of being joined in a splendid universal communion with all creatures, and a greater creativity and enthusiasm in resolving the world's problems. In the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, the Australian bishops say that lament, repentance, the effort to repair damage done, and the transformation of behaviour, just realised I've got another slide here, and the transformation of behaviour are the elements of a process of conversion. Notice how in Laudato Si, Pope Francis moves from, in chapter 1, a contemplation of creation, becoming painfully aware of the situation, next to reflection on relevant faith sources, remembering that it's God's creation that we have harmed and are harming. Then he moves to an analysis of key issues and goes back to wisdom sources, including science, deepening our understanding of how we're harming creation through what we do and what we fail to do. He then synthesises wisdom from different sources to provide a vision of an integral approach to ecology. And then he moves to some more general lines of approach, showing us how we might repair the damage done and behave differently. Only then does he bring us home to ecological education and spirituality as the heart of the Church's response, and in that context, calls us explicitly to personal and community conversion. So the call to conversion is a call to a new ecological spirituality. And he's demonstrated in the way that he structured this encyclical, the dynamics of conversion. Just lost my cursor there for a moment. So the word spirituality these days is used in so many ways that it can mean almost anything or actually nothing. So I see a spirituality as a person or community's way of understanding God, ourselves, the world, and our place in it, expressed in values, attitudes, dispositions, and practices. It's our way of responding to the transcendent. So Laudato Si calls us to be converted to a new spirituality, or perhaps better, to a renewed spirituality. Without it, no amount of Green Church activity will actually bring about lasting change. As the Australian bishops put it, an ecological conversion calls us to a renewed way of understanding the cosmos and humanity, a new vision of what it is to be a human being before God and in the world. It calls us to a new spirituality, or way of understanding and expressing our relationship with the divine in our lives. Again, Francis demonstrates a gradual approach. In the final chapter of Laudato Si, he starts with ecological education and slowly unpacks how we need to go beyond this to ecological ethics and ecological spirituality. He affirms the development in ecological education beyond centering on scientific information and consciousness raising and the prevention of environmental risks, to engaging with the system level thinking behind the dynamics driving ecological harm. But then he says that environmental education should facilitate making the leap towards the transcendent, which gives ecological ethics its deepest meaning. Environmental education should facilitate making the leap towards the transcendent, which gives ecological ethics its deepest meaning. And then he goes on to discuss instilling good habits, demonstrating a virtue ethics approach. Then he spells out the need for conversion to an ecological spirituality that's grounded in the convictions of our faith. And so he then retrieves from chapter 2 the theological foundations that we've just been discussing. He says that living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It is not an optional or secondary aspect of Christian experience. Pope Francis says that Christian spirituality proposes a different way of understanding quality of life from the technocratic and consumerist paradigm that we live in, that currently dominates our world. It encourages a prophetic and contemplative lifestyle marked by moderation, simplicity, gratitude, detachment from possessions, the avoidance of the dynamic of domination and the accumulation of pleasures. You'll find all this at number 222. He advocates the recovery of he calls it a healthy humility and a happy sobriety. He concedes that this is difficult if we aren't at peace with ourselves, but he says that inner peace is closely related to care for ecology and for the common good, because lived out authentically, it's reflected in a balanced lifestyle together with a capacity for wonder and awe, which takes us to a deeper understanding of life. So busyness and frenetic activity are enemies of awareness and inner peace. And Pope Francis cautions an integral ecology includes taking time to recover a serene harmony with creation, reflecting on our lifestyle and our ideals, and contemplating the Creator who lives among us and surrounds us, whose presence must not be contrived, but found, uncovered. That's at 225. So an ecological spirituality entails an attitude of the heart, which is attentive and present to each moment as a gift from God. And again, Francis's Ignatian spirituality is not far from the surface here. Of course, spirituality is not merely a personal and private thing. It engages our life together with others and in the world. Francis reminds us of our common source and our capacity and call to live together in communion with all creatures. He says, love, overflowing with small gestures of mutual care, is also civic and political. And it makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world. Love for society and the common good are outstanding expressions of charity, which affects not only relationships between individuals, but also macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones. An ecological spirituality, then, entails a sense of kinship with all people and all of creation, expressed in both interpersonal and structural action in favour of care for the most disadvantaged or vulnerable members of the universal communion of all of God's creatures. So the theological themes of creation through the Trinity, the universal communion of creatures, creation as a common inheritance, and the sacramentality of all creation underpins Francis's call in Laudato Si to an ecological conversion. It's a conversion from a false understanding of human beings as the centre or purpose of creation to knowing that we are God's creatures in communion with all of God's creation. It's a conversion away from a utilitarian attitude to the world to renewed appreciation of the cosmos as an expression of divine love that continues to unfold. It's a conversion to a renewed Christian spirituality in which our encounter with God becomes evident, unmistakably evident, in our relationship with the world around us. So I hope I've kept time reasonably and left time for discussion.
And now we're moving to the spirituality of Laudato Si. And as Pope Francis said himself, I'm interested in how an ecological spirituality grounded in the conviction of our faith can motivate us to a more passionate concern for the protection of our world. And that really just highlights the importance of the spirituality of Laudato Si. And so to present for us, we welcome Reverend Dr. Paul Chandler. And Dr. Paul, Reverend, was born and raised in Sydney, and he joined the Carmelites in 1969 and studied mostly in Melbourne, where he was ordained in 1975. So he's had a lot of experience in parishes in both Melbourne and Sydney. And his study is very interesting. He has a Bachelor of Arts Honours in Australian History and a licence in Theology from the Gregorian in Rome, which must have been a very exciting study, and graduate degree in Latin, and his doctorate's in medieval studies from Toronto, and that's what he's really interested in, the medieval churches and all the things that happened in those times. So Reverend Dr. Paul has taught church history and the history of spirituality at Yarra Theological Union for 20 years. And for the last 12 years, he's been spiritual director at Holy Spirit Seminary. So he's taught and given retreats widely in Australia and internationally, and so we're in very, very good hands with him as he unpacks in a lovely deep way the spirituality of Laudato Si. So a warm welcome to you, and thank you very much. And you might just need to unmute first.
Yep.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Good. Just get this screen up. I'm just going to try to go through fairly quickly some of the main points in spirituality and Laudato Si, but by way of beginning, I wanted to draw your attention to the first paragraph. As we all know, the phrase Laudato Si is taken from St. Francis's Canticle of the Creatures, as Pope Francis reminds us at the very beginning. He quotes one phrase from that canticle: "Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with coloured flowers and herbs." The word "through" there, "through our sister," is an interesting one. In fact, in the original Italian of St. Francis, in the Umbrian dialect of the 13th century, he uses the word "per," and that's basically impossible to translate in English, simultaneously at least, because it means three different things. We thank God for Mother Earth, or because of it, so we're thanking God for his creation. Per also means through, so we're thanking God through Mother Earth. And that is a hint at a theme that was raised by Ian Elmer and is in Laudato Si itself, that part of the gift and privilege of humanity is its particular consciousness, which is a way of bringing all of creation into conscious praise of God. But per also means by. And in that sense, Mother Earth doesn't need us at all. It was here long before we were, and it was already praising its creator simply by being what it is. And the other elements in the canticle, the sun and the moon and water and fire and so on, are all themselves praising the creator. So there's a whole kind of layered quality and a beautiful complexity that's already expressed in Francis's hymn, which really can't be captured in an English translation. Brian Maloney's book, the cover of which is illustrated there on St. Francis and his canticle, is interesting because it offers two different translations of the Canticle of the Creatures, and he says there could be really three or even four, just depending on how Francis's key words are interpreted. So I wanted to just begin by that as a sort of testimony to the spiritual and theological complexity of all that we're talking about. And not only to the complexity of our relationship to creation, but also to the possibilities of our reflection on it and our spiritual engagement with the planet, which is God's gift, first gift to us. Laudato Si begins in the usual way for these papal letters by looking at the recent magisterium. It has a sort of token reference to John the 23rd. Interestingly, it has nothing to say about Vatican II, because Vatican II simply had no apparent consciousness of ecology and the environment. But it does have a very key element that it proposes for us, which is reading the signs of the times. And there's certainly no doubt that one of the most important signs of our times is now the urgent need to care for the planet on which we live. Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict XVI all spoke about these issues, but briefly. I'd like just to go quickly through some of the main points in Laudato Si. Like a lot of Francis's documents, it's a little bit rambling in some ways. It's long, of course, but it does have a very clear structure. And most of his comments on spirituality in chapter 6, which is headed Ecological Education and Spirituality. And I think the presence of the word education there is a very crucial insight into what Francis feels is the task ahead of us. He realizes that, in fact, we face a quite difficult task in overcoming our inertia and often a sense of alienation because of the sheer magnitude of the task that we face. So what he's picking out are really educational needs and possibilities if we are to develop a genuinely ecological spirituality that expresses a respect and reverence for the gift that God has given us. He begins by talking about the need for a new lifestyle. Some of these things I think Sandy Cornish already spoke about. A lifestyle without compulsive consumerism, which is a constant critique in Laudato Si and elsewhere, of course, in Francis's teaching. And that liberation from a compulsive and destructive consumerism will need a new self-awareness and a conversion from our egotistical, egocentric, selfish impulses. He also asks us to consider the ways in which our mega consumption is itself a response to a kind of emptiness of heart, that we have more available to us than ever before, but there's a sense of dissatisfaction, anxiety, alienation, and spiritual emptiness. And so these steps for Francis are ways of finding new paths, not only to look after the planet, but to authentic human freedom. He speaks about some of the means that we would have to use to engage in this challenge. It's not comprehensive, of course, but he mentions things like consumer movements, which put pressure on producers to have ethical and sustainable ways of satisfying our needs, a new reverence for life, for sustainability, for justice and peace, for sharing with the poor of the world. These themes, of course, could become very oppressive, as they sometimes seem to be in the political discourse on respect for the environment. And it keeps coming back to the theme that our task must involve true joy and a true celebration of life. And he says a bit more about that I'll come to in a moment. And he also underlines that now we face a real moral imperative to assess our impact on the world and on other people. His second section is about educating ourselves in awareness of the covenant that we have between humanity and the environment. He talks briefly about the gravity of the ecological crisis that we face, and once again says that this is an educational challenge. We need to develop new habits. And he has a brief critique of many of the guiding myths of modernity, individualism, perpetual progress, competition, consumerism, the invisible hand of the market. And of course, all these things are constantly present in the politics and even in the sociology of a country like our own. And this is a theme that he comes back to repeatedly, that it's only by creating a new sort of harmony, multi-layered harmony, that we will be able to have the political and social strength to engage with these urgent issues, a harmony within ourselves, a far-reaching people, and even more far-reaching harmony with all living creatures, which demand a kind of respect that we have not yet developed, and ultimately a harmony with God, who has gifted us with all these things. Information is not enough, he says, nor is regulation, government regulation particularly. But new habits are required, new motivations, a new level of selflessness if we are to come to environmental responsibility. There's a fairly long section where he talks about how practical must be the implementation of this new consciousness. Things like avoiding plastic, planting trees, turning off the lights, carpooling, all those kind of things which we're quite familiar with as small but essential steps in creating a new relationship with the environment. He calls this generous and worthy creativity, and also speaks about how this new consciousness has to be forged in the institutions we already have, in the family, particularly in schools and in church institutions of all different kinds. As we know, of course, there are 1.4 billion Catholics in the world. So if we were to really put our energy into the environmental challenge, we would be a huge force for change. But so far we're not very well organised, and our consciousness is in many sectors not very high. So that's an immediately challenging part of this large task. How do we actually find ways to address it within the institutions that we already have? How do we resist the paradigm of consumerism is one of the practical questions that he asks. He says that part of this must be to appreciate the beauty of the world in which we live. And that is truly a spiritual conversion, and one that undermines self-interest and purely pragmatic and exploitative attitudes. So about people, life in general, society, and our relationship with nature. In a third section, he continues to speak about the means of conversion. It needs more than doctrine, he stresses. A new way of thinking of ourselves and a new way of acting day to day as protectors of God's handiwork. Elmer made interesting comments about the text in Genesis in which humankind is given dominion over creation, and how that's often been interpreted in ways that really cannot continue. We're not to dominate, but to protect what God has given and entrusted to us. Also, reconciliation for Francis is an act of repentance. We've already done much harm, so repentance is crucial if we are to find a new path. Some of the practical features of this spiritual conversion that he picks out are a fundamental attitude of gratitude, which has its counterpart in our sense of gratuitousness and generosity, which has to be full of tenderness, which is a word that Pope Francis uses a lot, tenderness towards others and tenderness towards the world in which we live. He says we must have a deep spiritual awareness of our communion with all living creatures, that we're part of nature, not above it, and that in turn is an imitation of the creativity of God, and that human superiority, and he does use that expression, is not for dominion but for responsibility. It continues that we need an awareness that each creature in its own way tells of its creator. And of course, a Christology is very central to the way Francis sees this challenge, that in Christ, God enters the material world, and as imitators of Christ and people possessed by the Spirit of Christ, we have to forge a Christ-like relationship to the material world. And how can we mistreat what God loves into existence? It's the kind of fraternity that's already reflected in the prayer of St. Francis. In the fourth section, entitled Joy and Peace, it speaks once again about how this new consciousness needs to be accepted in liberating and not oppressive ways. And there's a very rich paragraph there that's just worth looking at again, I think, paragraph 222. He says, Christian spirituality proposes an alternative understanding of the quality of life and encourages a prophetic and contemplative lifestyle, one capable of deep enjoyment, free of the obsession with consumption. We need to take up an ancient lesson found in different religious traditions and also in the Bible, the conviction that less is more. A constant flood of new consumer goods can baffle the heart and prevent us from cherishing each thing and each moment. To be serenely present to each reality, however small it may be, opens us to much greater horizons of understanding and personal fulfillment. Christian spirituality proposes a growth marked by moderation and the capacity to be happy with little. It is a return to that simplicity which allows us to stop and appreciate the small things, to be grateful for the opportunities which life affords us, to be spiritually detached from what we possess, and not to succumb to sadness for what we lack. This implies avoiding the dynamic of dominion and the mere accumulation of pleasures. That's really an extraordinary program of spiritual conversion there, and also an extraordinary program of education, which would have to start with the very beginning of education with small children, and which will call on artists, for example, and our forms of consumption. Some needs, or the fulfillment of some needs, actually diminishes us. So we need to find the happiness which limits our needs only to those which lead to our growth. He notes that in our century, the unfashionable values of sobriety and humility are now once again clear. And a sober and satisfying life can bring one to being at peace with oneself, but also requires it involves us in an inner harmony. And he mentions the attentiveness of Jesus, who contemplates the lilies of the field, and in his meeting with every person that he meets, has a genuine encounter with the other. And he mentions in passing just a small thing, grace before meals, as an act of transforming gratitude in daily life. Then I'll go quickly just to wind up, but he speaks about how there are civic and political requirements if we're to get anywhere with this program, and he sees them as expressions of love, gratuitousness, interdependence, the rejection of superficiality, and daily conduct which breaks with the logic of violence and exploitation. But as well as simple gestures, there must be larger strategies. So there has to be political and civic organisation. Something's gone wrong. I've got a couple of more slides, but they've disappeared. But that's fairly near the end anyway, and time is up. So they're the main things that I picked out from Francis's take on this spirituality that's in Laudato Si, ecological spirituality.
Thank you, Reverend Paul. That was absolutely fascinating tour through the spirituality that you uncovered in Laudato Si, and we thank you so much. Just from your opening words of that beautiful for Mother Earth, through Mother Earth, by Mother Earth, I think that just instantly captured our attention. And then you gave us so many practical ways of enhancing our spirituality through the actions of Laudato Si, that we're very grateful. So we'll spend a beautiful minute of reflection to just try and absorb some of those thoughts that really captured us. First of all, we're going to have a guided tour of the Laudato Si action platform, and Dr. Sandy Cornish is kindly going to lead us through that. So we'll hand back over to Sandy and thank her, because I'm sure we'll enjoy knowing where the resources are. You're just on mute, Sandy.
I just got a dialogue box telling me that I was on mute. You would think that I'd get that right by now after all these months of Zooming. So I'm just going to take you to the website of the Laudato Si action platform and show you about from there. So I'm just going to share my screen again. Can you see a website now? Yep, I can see people agreeing. Okay, so right up here, you've got the URL. It's simply Laudato Si action platform. So this is something that the Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development has built, because as you were just saying, 1.4 billion Catholics can be a huge force for change. So this is really meant to help people to really take concerted action to bring the commitments of Laudato Si into reality. And we'd also just been hearing about the importance of using the institutions that we already have. So this is structured around 7 Laudato Si goals and 7 sectors. But just to show you here on the homepage, you've got a little video embedded there of Pope Francis. It takes about 6 minutes, giving an introduction to the platform and inviting everybody to get involved in this action. Going down a bit further, you've got the 7 goals: responding to the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, ecological economics, sustainable lifestyles, ecological education, ecological spirituality, community engagement and participatory action. You can see here there's little arrows. So there's a short explanation of each of these goals, and that's worth diving into, because there you get a little bit more fleshed out what's in this goal or that goal. I think it's particularly important in relation to the response to the cry of the poor. So some of our other very important commitments here in Australia, like right relationships with First Nations people, are included here. Refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, children at risk, all of these things come under response to the cry of the poor. Also, defending human life from conception to death. So it brings together the whole range of life issues beyond just abortion and euthanasia, but everything about sustaining and promoting the dignity of life. So you can go through and see each of those, a little bit more detail of what's in each goal. So maybe we'll go up next to about, where we get a bit more of an explanation of the platform itself. So this is a collaboration between the Dicastery and a whole heap of other groups and movements. And they're trying to build this from the ground up. So Peter Arndt and I are involved in the working group around parishes and dioceses. A number of other Australians are on different working groups for the different sectors as well. And lots of organisations around the world are involved. On the 14th of November, these Laudato Si action plans will become available. So you're being invited to make a commitment to journey towards these 7 goals over 7 years. And there are 7 different sectors. So all these 7s will be making the hearts of our scripture scholars very happy. You can see it comes from the Leviticus vision. So there will be, if you make a commitment, then you'll have access to a planning guide that will help you to develop your plan about how your parish or your school or your family is going to work towards these goals over 7 years. And then each year you would put in a report on your progress. So the plans are one element of the platform. Another element is a library of resources to help you to take action, and there'll be events as well. Now, whether or not you make a formal commitment through the platform, you can still access this library of resources. And I'll take you there in a moment. The third element of the platform is providing community. It'll be a space where we can connect with others who are doing similar things or quite different things, and we can share stories of action. So they're the 3 elements of the platform. And if we go up to resources in the top level navigation, we can see that here is where you will access this great big library of resources. And you can search by title or keyword. There are a number of different languages. So if you're working with a community or group which has one of these other languages, they can also search in their own language. You can search by a particular goal or a sector. And you can narrow your search by the location. So here we have, as the first one that's appearing, one of the prayer cards for the Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, which is nice, and our little action card. But we could, for example, choose to look at, I think a number of you are involved in education, so let's go there. The education goal and the education sector. And let's see if we can find Australia and see what we get. Wollongong, there we go. This library is going to continually be built up. Yeah. So this is what's currently there. And as you can see, whether you've made a formal commitment or not, you can go and use these resources. The community section, it's already populated with some articles. Events will also be fleshed out over time too, and you'll be able to submit your events. Catholic Earth Care Families launch, there we go. This is making me think that the platform is knowing, has the data of where we're actually searching from, because we're getting the Australian resources at the top, which is nice. What we've got under more information. Yeah, so we've got the kind of FAQs here, the common terms, the planning guides. Now, I think it might have been at the bottom, looking for the different sectors. Yes, it was at the bottom of the About page, the different sectors. Families, parishes and dioceses, and I see now they're including Episcopal Conferences. And that's nice to see, because our Bishops' Conference has actually decided to sign up for this commitment. And that's why they've had to enlarge their thinking about what fits in this sector. My next aim is to encourage them to include federations of Bishops' Conferences, educational institutions of various kinds, healthcare institutions, organisations and groups, the economic sector, by which they mean, you know, businesses, farms, cooperatives, workers, everything to do with business and work, and then religious orders. So many of us could potentially join in with this platform under a number of different sectors. You might be a family who are in a parish, which is part of a diocese, and each one of those things might have its own plan. If you're a family with children at a school, that place might also have a plan. So it's very flexible, and I think it helps everyone who wants to make a commitment. If, for example, you're in a parish where no one else is awfully keen about this, you could join up through an organisation or as a family. there's going to be a way for you to engage with this platform, I think. Yeah. So I think that's really helpful as well. And the commitment pledge here. So there are two kinds of levels. Those of us who have already indicated that we want to be committed might have filled in this little form. It doesn't ask a whole lot there. You can see it's just basic contact details. And then if you do this, when the planning guides become available, you'll get an email about that, and you'll be invited to register and to register a plan. So the Laudato Si year will be ending on May the 24th, the anniversary of the encyclical. So by the end of the first year, it's hoped that you will have lodged your first plan, which will really be pretty much where things are up to and what it is that you hope to do over the 7-year period. And then each year you'll be encouraged to put in a progress report. How is that going? Okay. So I think those are the key things to know about the action platform. The website is still developing. Each time I visit, I see something new there. But already there's quite a lot of information, and it's good to see that resource library beginning to be filled out. So perhaps I'll stop sharing there and hand back to Elizabeth for questions and whatever comes next.
Thank you so much, Sandy. That was a wonderful tour through the platform, and it's really exciting to see that the resources are being populated there, and I'm sure it gives us lots of scope for practical action, and I'm excited in the education field to see all the opportunities that it presents.